Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. Today's topic is something that we get asked about a lot. Do infants grieve? Do toddlers grieve? Do preschoolers grieve? Yes, they do. They all do. And that's what we're going to focus on today.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
So joining me today is one of our grief counselors, Lauren. She's the executive director of our clinical services. And I'm so glad you're here today, Lauren, because this is something we talk about a lot. And so it's nice to be able to share this with others. So before we get started, welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So we're going to talk about young children and how they experience loss. So today what we're really talking about is our infants and toddlers and preschoolers. So before we get into that, we always like to go back and just say, what is grief? And Lauren, I feel like you and I have said this so many times. Every group we lead, everything we do, we always come back to that basics. What is grief? So what is grief, Lauren?
Especially when we talk with children and little ones, one of the ways that we just like to say it so simply is that grief is all the thoughts and feelings that run around inside our bodies after someone we love has died. And so basically that is just all of the experiences that happen naturally within us as a response to that loss.
And so a lot of times when, especially this group that we're talking about today, people will say, well, then how does an infant grieve? How does a toddler grieve, a preschooler? And we're certainly going to get to that because the fact is they do grieve and mourn. And so we talked about grief. And so mourning, we know, is that outward expression. And mourning is what heals us. We know that we have to mourn, put our grief into some sort of motion expression. So again, people are thinking, well, how do infants and toddlers and preschoolers do that? And they most certainly do, and we're going to get to that. I like Alan Wolfelt, who we know very well as a grief educator. He has a great quote that says, if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. And so that's, again, more evidence and proof that infants, toddlers, and preschoolers can grieve because they are certainly old enough to love. So today, Lauren, I thought we would start talking about infants and toddlers and preschoolers and how their grief shows up, how we can see it now and then in the future. And then we'll talk about what they need from those that are caring for them, the caring adults around them, and then some of those challenges. So let's just jump in and let's just start with infants and toddlers and their grief reactions. In this podcast, we always talk about grief reactions because grief is normal, grief is real. We grieve physically, emotionally, spiritually, cognitively, and behaviorally, and we all have grief reactions. We're supposed to. That's normal. So let's just jump into those infants and toddlers. And Lauren, what are some of the things that you have seen with children that age?
Well, at that age, when we're talking about young children, they don't have the same ability of older children or adults to be able to verbalize their grief reactions or even to be able to identify the feelings. And so a lot of times we see it come out in their behaviors and in their mood. We might see heightened irritability. We might see changes in their sleeping, changes in their eating. We might see an increase in separation anxiety because when there has been a significant loss for a child, their instinct is to seek comfort, to seek nurturing, to, they want their trusted caregivers to be near them. And they have sometimes that heightened anxiety of when trusted caregivers leave, because they have experienced loss, potentially of somebody who filled that role or somebody who was close to them, and they have a hard time understanding that. And so they're seeking just that reassurance, that nurturance, which, a lot of times they seek that through physical closeness.
Definitely that loss of safety. You don't have to have all the verbal skills in the world or be, in double digits to experience that loss of safety. And I think that's what we see with infants and toddlers, especially if it's their mom or their dad or their primary caregiver who has died, is that loss of safety. And that comes out through all of those things you said. So there's the loss of touch and connection and attachment. And we know attachment is so critical at this age. And so, again, they can't say that. They can't express it with their words. They can't express it through art or anything. But it certainly does come through that loss of connection. And I love how you said the irritability. I've worked with several families over the year who had maybe children of various ages, but there was also an infant. And obviously, when they're in the office, they're usually talking more about the children who are, outwardly expressing their grief in ways that we're familiar with through verbal and things. But when you would ask about the baby, they'd kind of look at me a couple of times like, well, they're a baby. But then they'd start in that irritability, the sleeping disruptions, the clinginess, and then definitely separation, just that fear, because they can't express like older children can, that I'm afraid something might happen to you now. And so, so right there, infants and toddlers certainly grieve. They grieve in very different ways. And it's hard because they can't tell us, and we can assure them and soothe them in those physical ways, but they also can't understand, when we try to tell them about grief at this age. And that's something we're going to talk about too, is that infants and toddlers grieve at the age they are as an infant and toddler. But just like with any of us, and just like we say all the time in this podcast, they're going to continue to grieve for the rest of their lives. So when we talk about what they need, infants and toddlers have needs of that physical touch now, but then they're going to have other needs when they do have those language skills. So preschoolers, let's get into those. And, 3 to 5-year-olds, they have a few more words and they have more behaviors. So how have you seen grief show up in that age group?
Well, as you said, they at this age are better able to hear and understand, maybe what has happened, and they understand and are able to express some emotions related to that and questions. A lot of times we hear many questions.
So many questions.
Kids this age, often on repeat. And part of that's because even though there is, certainly more understanding than a toddler, children at this age still haven't quite, just where they are developmentally, they haven't quite been able to understand very abstract concepts. And death can be very abstract, especially the permanency of death, the idea that when somebody dies, they are dead forever. And that concept of forever is very hard for a young child to be able to just sort of wrap their mind around. And so, additionally, their concept of time is very different than an adult's. And so sometimes there are questions, or they have a hard time, kind of conceptualizing that someone who has died is not coming back. And so for them, it's something that, may seem very temporary. Another thing that we see with children this age is what we call magical thinking. Children at this age, again, just very where they are developmentally, they are very self-oriented. Their view of the world is very much centered on themselves. Yes. And what that can also mean is when something changes, when something happens, when there's a loss, there can be thoughts of, did I do something to make this happen? And sometimes they try to connect dots to try to understand what has happened. they try to connect those dots in a way that adults would never have even dreamed that they would. And so because of that, it is very important that when we are talking with children about death and about when somebody has died, we want to use very simple, clear, honest information. We don't have to share every single detail, but we want, what we tell them to be clear and honest, and to lay the foundation for them to know that they can ask those questions, and they can ask those questions over and over again, so that they can process that and start to understand it gradually, but in a healthy way.
That's so important, because we often hear, or we are often asked, do I really have to tell them? They're so young, they don't really understand. So what if I just don't even mention it? And it's like, well, they're going to realize that person is no longer there in a physical presence, and they will connect their own dots. That magical thinking is still there, and they're still trying to figure out, well, why did this important person who I love and who loved me and a part of my world, now they're not physically here? I'm going to come up with some reason. And so that's why we think, and you said you don't have to tell all the details, but we do need to use that clear language to help them, because oftentimes, and I know this sounds unreal, that magical thinking, they come up with things that are worse, meaning for them, because they connect it to them. Like, I had something to do with this, because the world is so much about them. So I'm so glad you said that. Oftentimes we see it with behaviors too, and that's very upsetting to adults, parents, caregivers of the child. So what kind of behaviors have you seen?
Similar to when we were talking about infants and toddlers, and we said there might be some heightened irritability, that actually is a grief reaction that we see throughout the lifespan. And so, you might see increased tantrums. Again, you might see some of that separation anxiety. They may be able to use more words, but the emotion is still the same, that I'm afraid of being away from somebody who feels safe for me. Sometimes we see some regressive behaviors. Children may act like a child who's younger. They may, for example, use more baby talk, or you might see that they are interested in maybe toys or books or shows that are maybe ones that they've kind of lost interest in because they're a little bit, geared towards a younger child. But a lot of times regressive behaviors are a way of a child saying, this feels safe, this feels comforting, this reminds me in some way of a time when things felt safe and comforting.
Yeah, you can see that. Maybe it's things that you thought, milestones you had passed, like thumb sucking, sometimes bedwetting again, things like that. And a lot of times the adults will say, what's happening here? Or because that adult is grieving too, it becomes more stressful. And again, it comes back to what we said about infants and toddlers. It's that safety, it's need for safety. I've seen 5-year-olds want to be carried all the time. Carry me like I was a baby. And it's that nurturing and that safety. Yeah, that's the need that they're expressing. When I was listening to you earlier, I was thinking about, I was with a toddler this weekend, and a preschooler this weekend, and we were at a restaurant, and they told us it was going to be a 10-minute wait, and it was a 40-minute wait. And the language he was using is that this is forever. We're never going to eat again, And just as I was listening to you, I was just thinking that language with time, that concept is so, they're learning it. They're learning this thing about time, but it's such a foreign thing. And forever, for that preschooler was, a 30-minute extra wait at a restaurant. Whereas children, what does this forever mean? And that's why those repetitive questions, like they wake up the next morning, well, is mommy going to be here today? Where's mommy? And that is so hard for the adults, because we understand time. We understand forever, even though we hate it. For a child, it's that development. It's just that pop up. It's a new day. Are they here today? And that is certainly a complicating factor with their ages. So also with our preschoolers, and you mentioned this earlier when we were talking about how grief shows up, is the many, many, many questions on repeat, which is so exhausting for the adults around. But let's talk about that and how we talk about that with families.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the questions that I hear a lot is, I've explained this to them, but they don't seem to be getting it.
Yes.
And our response is often, well, that's to be expected. Mm-hmm. And it's still important to explain it to them, because each time you do, they're starting to get it a little bit more. Mm-hmm. You're laying that foundation for them. But just where they are developmentally, they may not fully be able to. And that's why they may ask some of the same questions over and over again. It's not because that you're not explaining it well. It's just that that's how they have to process it. So what I usually recommend for families is to come up with one or two simple, clear sentences to address whatever that question is, and just use those same two sentences every time you answer the question. A lot of times people think, well, they didn't get it the first time, I must need to say it in a different way. And that's not necessarily the case. And it's also easier on you if you can say, okay, this is an answer that I feel comfortable with, that I can sort of rehearse and practice, and I can say calmly. Yes. That is what is so important, is being able to be with the child, be present with them, and answer their questions in a very loving and kind, and answer their questions in a very loving and calm way.
Yeah. So the same thing, the questions, we're certainly talking about that, but then, like you said, we want them, say the same information on repeat back to them so that they can absorb it. Once they start absorbing it, then they start saying it on repeat. And sometimes in places where it's uncomfortable for the adult. We hear from a lot of families, we talk about the grocery store so much in this podcast, but kids will be at the grocery store in line and they look at the person behind them. My daddy died. And the discomfort that causes for, if that child is there with their father or their mother or grandmother or whoever, it's like, oh gosh, then I feel like I have to explain, or why do they say that out loud? Or, I've even had children who've said more things, in detail about their loved one's death. My daddy, his heart stopped in the bathroom. I had a child who said that because it was very confusing to her because her father had a heart attack in the bathroom, or my daddy was shot, and so they'll say, sometimes families say to us, can you make them stop saying that? And it's their way of trying to process it. And they don't understand that they're making people feel uncomfortable. What they're trying to say is, I do not understand why this happened and where my daddy went, but this is what I'm being told. And every time I say it, I'm absorbing it and feeling it more. But man, that's hard for the adults around.
Yeah, absolutely.
So children also, we say this a lot, show us their grief. So let's talk a little bit, Lauren, about how preschoolers show their grief, like through their play.
Well, we know that play is the language of children. Because they don't have the same verbal abilities, and even, like we've said, like with preschoolers, of course, they can communicate verbally, but not at the same level, of course, as an older child or an adult. And so, it may be hard for them sometimes to verbalize some of these complicated thoughts and feelings. Often we see it come out in their play because play is the natural language of children. And so that means there may be themes of death in a grieving child's play. And that can be very alarming for the adults in their world. And, a lot of times there can be concern of, what does that mean? And, this feels very dark. And our response to that is that child doing exactly what they're needing to do. They are processing something difficult that has happened to them, that it's hard for them to understand. And they're processing it in their natural way, which is through play. And that's a positive thing, that they have the ability and the safety to do what they need to do to work through their grief in that way.
I was trying to think of some of the ways I've seen children or, families have talked to me about their play with those death themes. I'm sure you have some too. I was thinking a lot of times they'll start playing funeral because they've never been to a funeral before and they went to this thing and there are all these people. And so they'll start seeing that. I had a child one time who loved to play with his cars, and he started lining them up like the procession. So he'd have this long line all the way down the hall, and it was very upsetting to the rest of the family, but they were going to a funeral, and he was proudly announcing it. I have had, if children were there when their loved one died or witnessed it, kind of working through some of that through their play. And again, that can be upsetting, talk of blood. And I've had people say, she didn't even see any, but again, disturbing things to us as adults, but they're trying to figure out, and especially if they don't maybe know, they know that blood is in our bodies, and when they get cut, they bleed, and a Band-Aid stops it. And so kids sometimes will start processing all the way through that with blood. And I had a grandmother one time say, I need her to stop talking to me about blood, but she was trying to figure out what happened. Yeah. I've had kids play out heaven, if that was their religious belief. And a lot of times in that play, you would see like peaceful themes and joy and happiness and spirituality. And again, sometimes that's a little bit more comfortable for families than maybe some of these other things that feel more dark, like you said.
Kind of along those same lines, I've seen children play out sort of what they would like things to be.
Yes.
Play out sort of what their wishes are.
Yes.
Sometimes you might see like themes of, like superheroes or themes of families, that are sort of what the child views as ideal and how it should be. Sometimes we'll see a child play out like a death with their toys, and then the person comes back to life,
Yes.
and then they die, and then they come back to life, and there's sort of that repetitive play in that way.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because that goes back to what we were saying about understanding permanence. It's like, well, they're dead, but now they're alive, and it's a lot of times the wish. So, yeah, I'm so glad you said that. And again, a lot of it's so hard on the adults around them, because that's what we want. We would love that to be able to be the reality. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think our goal here is so that adults hopefully can
Yes.
know that that's okay. And in doing so, they allow the child to continue that. Because a lot of times adults, and understandably so, their first instinct is to sort of rush in and stop that.
Yes.
Like, let's not play like that.
Yes.
And for children, they don't need that to be stopped. They need for that space to do what they need to do naturally, because as we know, children have a lot of natural resilience. They're very good grievers generally when they're given that supportive
Yes.
space.
I'm really glad you said that, because when we're talking with parents and caregivers of children this age at the grief center, and they're coming in for counseling, we tell them all the time, they're here. They came here for an hour an appointment, but they're going to continue to grieve outside of this 1 hour here with us. And so once they start, feeling safe in their expression, then yes, it tends to show up and show up and show up. So that's another important factor is that we always talk about when we're talking about children, is letting the other adults in that child's life know, and to know that this is expected and normal and healthy. And again, about the swooping in and stopping it behaviors. Yeah, so important. So that leads us right into, what do grieving children need? So we've talked a lot about infants and toddlers and preschoolers. That's the group we're focusing on today, and what their grief looks like, how it shows up. So let's talk a little bit about what they need. And we've said this several times already, but the adults around them, we need those adults to be supportive. And that probably means a lot of different things to different people. But let's talk a little bit about what that means to us.
Well, we've talked about this idea of safety for grieving children, and that with a loss comes a loss of a sense of safety. And so an important way of supporting a young child is helping them to feel safe, both physically and emotionally. Now, we never want to promise a child something that we can't 100% guarantee.
Right.
So, for example, when a child is showing some separation anxiety, especially, an older child, we don't want to say nothing bad is ever going to happen to me. Because,
I promise.
Right.
I'll always be here.
Right. Because that's not something that we can guarantee 100%. And the child knows that.
Right.
Because now in their world, there's the possibility that bad things can happen.
Yes.
But what we can reassure children is that they will always be taken care of. We can reassure them that we are doing everything that we can to stay safe and to stay healthy. And of course, we do that with young ones in a very simplistic way. And some of that is just sort of that reassurance that comes from your behaviors, that you are there when you say you're going to be, that you do what you say you're going to do, and that they have just lots of that physical closeness, because that's a way that they are able to communicate that safety to them.
Absolutely. And also, we talked about this too, is showing grief to children. We get this all the time, like, I don't know why they're doing this, because I don't cry in front of them, or I don't talk about, his dad anymore. And that's where we want to stop people and say, okay, that seems like that's the right thing, because, you're not getting upset, but they actually need to see, we are the role models for our children for all the things. And unfortunately, we have to help them know how to grieve as well. And so it is okay to cry. It is okay to say, I am feeling very sad. I am really missing your mom, to use that language, to connect it to the emotion that you're having. It's okay to be mad. It's okay to tell children you're mad. Now, obviously, with anything, if it's an intense eruption that maybe is going to feel very scary, or maybe you as the adult don't really feel in control of yourself, that's what we do want to shield from the child. But crying, even some people say, well, I'm a really loud crier. You can say to the child, Mommy's a really loud crier, and I'm just really, really sad, but showing them feelings, telling them your feelings, helping them so that when they have that reaction, it feels more normal than abnormal. They don't start to connect shame to that feeling or that grief reaction.
And a lot of times I'll suggest offering a reassuring statement along with that as well, that this is what I need to do to get my feelings out. And this is what helps me so that I can be okay. And, just giving them that reassurance that because I'm showing emotion now doesn't mean that I am going to be doing this exact thing always and forever.
Right. Now, one of the things that I think is possibly the hardest for people who are taking care and love children, especially this age group, so let's think our infants and toddlers and preschoolers, is to have that empathetic ear. And you said this earlier, being there, showing up for them, offering them support through touch and reassurance, but not swooping in to take it away. And that's hard. I know I've probably in my own family done that, because it's your instinct when you see a child of this age hurting and upset, you want to literally swoop them up and hold them and tell them everything is okay and do anything in the world to take their mind off of it. Here's a bright, shiny toy or whatever. But really what they need is the gift of our presence and our reassurance and our love and time to be in that moment with that feeling without us telling them that what you need to do is push all of this away, shove it away. And that's what we're saying when we try to take it away.
Yeah. A lot of times, one of my favorite responses to children is, I'm so glad you told me that, or I'm so glad you showed me that. Or helping them, especially with little ones, identify the feelings. So, if they're, crying, for example, and you're holding them and you're comforting them, a statement such as, I know you're feeling so sad. I'm feeling so sad too. And what that is a form of education. Children at this age are learning about emotions anyway, and you're helping them to connect a word with what they're feeling, which will help them be able to continue to communicate those emotions as they grow.
And that's where resources come into play. There's so many children's books that are focused around feelings, just all feelings, not even just necessarily a grief book, but just helping children. This is something developmentally they're doing anyway at this time of their life, is identifying what these feelings are, how they show up, what they look like, and what I can do with them. And so there's so many books out there. It's great to have even a feelings chart in your house. I suggested that to someone recently, and they said, I don't want my house to look like a doctor's office. And I said, no, you're teaching them. Just, like you have other things in your house, like they don't know, they can't remember, they don't have this word bank of confused and bored, but when they see the faces, that's how I am. And it also validates and takes the shame out because there's another face in this world with that feeling that I'm having. So those are some great resources.
Yeah, absolutely. If somebody put this on paper, then I'm not the only one.
That's right. That's right. So definitely support is so important. Memorialization is so important. And this is especially true with this age group because they're not going to remember a funeral. They're not going to remember the time that the family all gathered and the support and those kind of things. And so even beyond just that, they're going to struggle to remember the person who died. Their memories are very limited. And the support of adults, it's important that we help cement those memories for them. And that can be done in so many ways, and it can feel very overwhelming. And so I will say, if you're listening to this today and this is where you are, you have time to do this. It's not something that, they need in the next week, but when they are 7, they may be asking more questions, or when they're 10, do we have mommy's funeral? Can I watch that? So putting together literally these concrete things that can help them continue to memorialize as they're older. One thing that I love, and I really try to get families to do, and it's hard, so we go back to that dosing. We talk about dosing a lot here, but getting different family members to write down or record stories and memories so that when this child is older and grieving and has more, of the brain connection and putting these thoughts together, they have those things. And that's just so important because memorialization is not just something that happens in the first week after someone dies and that's it, it's over. It is ongoing for healthy mourners. Have you seen, Lauren, any ways, I'm just trying to think of other ways that families have done that for children when they're older?
I think that there are so many opportunities to cement memories, to really just help a child continue to get to know their loved one as they grow. Mm-hmm. If that person were still alive, a child would come to know them and understand them in different ways as they themselves grow. Mm-hmm. And that can still happen even though that person is no longer here in the same way, through the things that other family members and people in that child's life say and do in relation to that person. So essentially, the goal is not to avoid talking about them. The goal is not to avoid, thinking about them, but really, take advantage of any opportunity to connect what's happening in the present moment with that person. Mm-hmm. One thing that I think children love is hearing about ways that they are maybe like the person who died, especially if it's a family member. Yes. Maybe ways that they look like them or ways that they act like them, or things that maybe they're interested in that their loved one would have been interested in, and letting them know those connections as they come up throughout their life.
I'm thinking of a client I saw in the last few weeks. His mom died when he was a baby, and he's, in first grade now, and he got in trouble for talking, and it was becoming a thing, and the note went home, and Dad was very upset with him, and he's apparently getting into trouble a lot for talking, and his grandmother took him aside and said, "I want to tell you something." And she had a note from when her daughter was about the same age, about how much she talked in school. And she was able to say, "Your mommy got in trouble for talking all the time." And he's in trouble. Obviously, this is something he needs to work on. But for a moment, he was, "I'm like my mommy." And I just thought that was really neat because, it takes a village when we're taking care of these grieving children. And so, his dad loves him very much, but he's just very frustrated, like, we've got to get this under control. But then the grandmother was able to show him that. And actually, his behavior has improved, because she said, "I had to work on this with your mommy, and she got in trouble." And he asked her, he said, "Did she get grounded?" And, so it was just, again, I am like my mommy. And because the memory bank for him is not there. We've been talking about, especially with this age group, big maybe feelings because of the lack of language. So helping them learn regulation and calming is really important. And I would say that's probably something that we talk a lot about with the caregivers of children this age. And so how have you helped families learn how to help preschoolers and toddlers regulate and calm?
Well, I think a huge first step when it comes to helping a child regulate is knowing how to regulate yourself.
Absolutely.
And one reason why this is so important is that when a child is dysregulated, maybe they are tantruming, maybe they're, just showing a lot of emotion, maybe it is not at a convenient time because it almost never is.
Yes.
That activates your responses. That can be sensory overload for you. That can maybe trigger emotions for you because potentially you are also grieving. And so sort of a strategy that we encourage adults to use is to, first of all, imagine that you have a pause button.
Yes.
And you imagine that when you're noticing that this child is experiencing what we call a grief burst, a expression of intense emotion, use your pause button to just notice what is happening, to just label this as a grief burst. This is not my child trying to defy me. This is not, them attempting to push buttons. This is a grief burst. And then stop what you're doing. This is the one that's really hard because dropping what we're doing, even for a moment, is challenging.
It is, yeah.
Because there's a lot of demands, understandably, on adults caring for young children. But try to just drop your agenda just for now. Doesn't have to be for the rest of the day, but just for a moment so that you can be present with that child. And then breathe. This helps you to lower your stress response. Taking slow, deep breaths is the foundation for any regulation. Remember, you have that role as a role model. So that child is looking to you for how to manage big emotions. Try to make a statement that acknowledges your child's perspective. I can see that you're really angry that this is not working out the way you'd like, or that you don't get to play with this right now, or whatever it may be. And it's okay to be angry. And then you're validating the feeling. That doesn't mean you have to give in to, what the child is saying or what they're, wanting, but you're acknowledging the emotion that's behind it and you're naming it. You're giving them that education. And then with that, you're already, I think, probably at this point in the process of trying to summon up every ounce of patience that you have. And you're just going to continue to do that to try to create that safe space so that they can express what they need to. The goal here is not to just shut it down. The goal is to allow them that space for expressing. And then, there may be opportunities before you move on with your day that you want to try to teach a child, like, for example, we can't do this right now. Let's think of another way that we can show our anger. We can't show our anger by hitting, but let's think of something else that we can do that's safer. But you want to wait until a child's calm before you do that because they won't be able to hear you.
Yeah. Always, taking an opportunity to come back when, because that's what sometimes people will say, well, I just can't let them become the bad kid, especially when we're trying to teach them this. And it's like, you're not being the bad kid, but they can't hear you when they're like that. You're going to get more, everyone's just going to continue to escalate and escalate and escalate. So this is a way to get people to breathe and de-escalate, and so that we can come back to it and have a productive conversation. I worked with a dad once who just was really, he had big emotions, his children did, and we talked about this pause button. And he started using his watch, because he always had his watch on. And he said that for him, he would touch that. And that was literally like his pause. Like that was his connection to himself that just kind of started this process. So sometimes it's helpful to have something like that you can do to get your brain like, okay, I know what I need to do. I need to breathe now. So touch my watch, pause, breathe, so that I can help them breathe, and then you come back to it, like you said, come back and let's talk about yesterday or let's talk about earlier when this happened. And I've seen kids, they can do that when they're regulated. We've talked a lot about expression. We talked earlier about mourning. That's what heals us. Children need expression. We've talked about so many ways already that they express through their play, through the behaviors that are not always so pleasing, like tantrums or regression. That's all expression. Because again, they don't have the words that we have. So a lot of times as adult, our expression is much more verbal. Theirs is, again, going to be more through their behaviors and things like that. So, and their play. And so just remembering to give them opportunities. One thing that I don't think we mentioned earlier is a lot of times, especially preschool children, are starting to color and draw. And so a lot of times that's where their grief will come out too, is through drawing pictures of their family, and a lot of times they'll put the loved one who died right there in the middle of the family. And that sometimes is upsetting to people, but that's their family. And that's healthy mourning and expression. They're trying to learn how our family is going from this family of all of us physically present to some of us physically present. So expression is just so important. One of our favorite things that we love to talk to people about, because they think it's a bad coping skill, but it's a good coping skill, is that distraction and avoidance. So that is important with preschoolers and toddlers as well. And so what do you think about distraction and avoidance for this age group?
Yeah, so as much as we talk about how important it is to spend time with our grief and to create space for it, we also have to step away from it. And people of all ages who are grieving have to do that. They have to sort of find that balance of being able to lean into their grief and being able to step away from it. Children do that very naturally. In fact, they can switch gears much more quickly and efficiently than adults do. They just naturally, when they have sort of reached their limit of being able to spend time with those heavy emotions, they are able to step away from that, and then they're ready maybe to just go play. Mm-hmm. And so, we've had families who, like, maybe a child will have a moment where they're crying and it's really hard and it's really hard to watch and it's really intense, and then the adult is comforting them, and all of a sudden the child's like, okay, I'm ready to go play basketball now. And the adult is just sort of left reeling, what just happened? But that's actually just very, very normal. And that is a child sort of engaging in that natural balance of stepping away from their grief when they need to. And so we want to give them those opportunities as well. And a lot of times that also means that processing grief for children is often on their timeline.
Yes. The grocery store.
Exactly. So there may be times where we've had adults tell us things like, whenever I check on them, whenever I ask them how they're doing, or whenever I say, hey, do you want to talk about feelings, or do you want to talk about mom? They'll say, no, I want to go play, Yeah. And so that'll concern adults sometimes. And then a lot of times then it might come up other times which maybe don't feel as convenient.
Right.
And again, that's just because that child is sort of naturally engaging in that balance on their time.
And we've talked so much about safety. That's such a need for children this age and grieving children this age. So another thing that can be confusing for the adults, the child's been fine all day and now it's bedtime and we're in that bedtime routine, and now all of a sudden they're having maybe big emotions. They're crying, they're distressed, or they want to talk. Or I've even had a dad say, I just feel like I need to hide these books that people gave us about feelings and grief, because that's the one they want to read every night when we go to bed and dad's tired of reading it, those kind of things. And so I think it's just important to remember with children the importance of stable routines. And a lot of times when the routine, we're in our routine, we're going to bed, we're doing the bedtime routine, the normal things, we're going to bed at our good time, we're not staying up really, really late or things like that. That tells a child, I'm safe. And when they feel safe, it allows the other things to come out, which oftentimes is their grief. So bedtime feels safe. This routine feels safe. It's oftentimes, a lot of one-on-one attention where there's not a lot of other distractions around. And so because of that stable routine, I feel safe. So here come the questions again. That is just so important. And we've talked so much about reassurance and how much that can help, with a child. Like I'm reassuring you, I'm hearing you, I'm validating you, and then they can feel okay then to go on back with maybe the distraction of play or something like that. So we've talked a lot about what grief looks like, what they need, and we've sort of already kind of hit on these, but I think just to help any of caregivers who are listening to this podcast, what are the challenges with this? Because there are challenges. And the first one is, and I think we've both said this already, you are also grieving. If an infant, toddler, or preschooler is grieving, you are grieving as well. You are grieving, say that again, and you're caring for this young child who is also grieving. And remember, we grieve physically. You are likely just physically exhausted. We've talked about the emotions. We as adults grieve spiritually, cognitively, behaviorally. You're having normal grief reactions as well. You are dealing with so many new normals, but then you also have a young child who needs you physically, who we've already said, you get to be the grief role model, all these things. That is hard. We know that. You have a lot of things on your plate, but you have to remember that you are grieving too, and that you need care for your grief, and that you need attention for your grief. Brain fog. We talked about teaching you about a grief burst and how to hit the pause button. I've had people come back in and say, I can't remember. Is it supposed to be a stop sign, I say? And it's like, all right, we don't have to get all caught up in the details. We just need to figure out a way to help us know to stop and calm ourselves down in those big situations. So remember, you have normal grief. We've talked so much about irritability. I was laughing to myself earlier, Lauren, when you said, a lot of people experience irritability with their grief. I almost said, yes, absolutely, 100%. That's probably one of my main emotions that I've experienced with grief is so much irritability. So you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to beat up yourself if you, maybe didn't respond the best way that one time. You're listening to this podcast today. You're trying. You want to know. Be kind to yourself. You have your own grief and your own grief reactions, and then you have a little person who's grieving. So what are some other challenges, Lauren?
Well, I think, what you said just affects your ability to be present and to regulate and all of those things. And so I just want to emphasize that again, because so often we hear sort of this self-judgment from adults who are caring for a child, and maybe they feel like they weren't able to respond in the ideal way always, that they weren't able to be as present as they would have liked. And so just know that that is understandable, and that this is a process, this is a journey for all of you. Even if the person who died, maybe you weren't personally as close with as the child was, you are still grieving because a child you love is grieving, and you carry that. And the loss has caused changes in your life. And so given all of that, it is so important that adults who are caring for grieving children take care of themselves. I can't tell you how many times we have families who will reach out to us, and the primary caregiver will say something like, I just need to make sure the kids are okay, and then maybe I'll focus on myself later.
Right.
And we really talk with them about that. And we encourage adults to care for themselves while they are caring for children, or while they are seeking additional help for children. Because when an adult is caring for themselves, that has a positive effect on the children as well. And so whether that's through, professional resources or things like support groups or even utilizing things like this podcast, just know that time that you're investing and energy that you're investing in those things, even if it feels like for yourself, know that that's not selfish. That is helping you be able to do what you need to do to care for a grieving child. And it's also okay to ask for help from other trusted adults in your life.
Right.
Even just help in practical ways and logistical ways with, babysitting or taking kids to appointments or to school or activities or whatever, needs to happen. Allowing other adults to help enables you to be able to continue to do this work of caregiving, because as often we say with so much as it relates to grief, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. Right. And it's not something you're meant to have to do alone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think just going back to that quote we said at the beginning of Alan Wolfelt's, if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve and old enough to mourn. And so certainly our infants and toddlers and preschoolers do grieve, and they do need support, and they do need opportunities for expression and memorialization. Well, we talked about a lot today. And if you remember nothing else, we hope that you just remember, in the midst of all the messiness of grief and unanswered questions, that the love you have and give to your child is all you need. So repeat that. Wherever you are listening to this podcast, repeat after me. I am doing the best I can, and that is enough. Did you repeat it? We certainly hope so, because it is enough. And thank you so much, Lauren, for being here today and for talking with me, and just helping people know that infants, toddlers, and preschoolers do grieve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.